What's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. My name's Micah, and today we're beginning work on our white 2001 Dodge Dakota. Christmas is over, just had New Year's, we're back in town. All the family stuff is over, it was fantastic. So now we gotta start turning some wrenches, and I could not be more excited. So all of our parts showed up here. So what, we've got, these should be the headlights, I believe. We've got our suspension lift here for it. The body lift is actually here. These are some light bulbs that we're gonna put in our new headlights. We've got our LED third brake light. I don't even know what this is, but we got that too. Oh, there are corner little LED markers. That's what they are. And then this box here is gonna be our LED taillights. You'll see them soon. I love these things. And then of course, don't forget about those 35-inch mud tires that we've got. They're actually in our other garage right now. So, we're gonna do the 2-inch suspension lift on this bad girl today. So basically what that entails, we're gonna put 2-inch blocks in the rear under the leaf springs on the axle. And in the front, we're just gonna crank our factory torsion keys. We're gonna see how much lift we get out of those, see if we get to our 2-inch mark, maybe a little more. So we'll kind of see how that starts to look, but this should get fun. So first things first, we gotta take some WD-40 and we've gotta hit all those bolts that we're about to turn with a little bit of this stuff, just so they can sit for a little while, kind of soak, so that they loosen up, so that they kind of turn off. Some of those nuts come up off of those bolts and those studs a little bit easier. So I'm gonna spray all the bolts for the rear axle, those U-bolts. I'm actually gonna spray the bolts on our torsion keys as well. So we will do that first and then we'll start ripping in. All right, so we sprayed all the bolts and nuts that we're gonna take off. So we're kind of under the rear end of the truck right now. So you can see the U-bolts here. We gave a good spritzing of the old WD-40. So those we're gonna pull off. I'm gonna disconnect the lower parts of the rear shock here. I spritzed the sway bar links as well. Sometimes you have to take those off, sometimes you don't. And on these old Dodges, sometimes it gets pretty scary looking under here as far as rust goes. I mean, some of these U-bolts and axles look pretty rusty and crusty, which with our, rear lift kit, we do have new U-bolts that go around those leaf springs and the axle, so we don't really have to worry about those. We just have to get them off without breaking. But nothing looks too terrible, so an impact gun is gonna help tremendously, in getting some of these old rusty bolts off. And then if you hit them with, a WD-40 or something similar to that, that's gonna make life easy as well. So we're gonna start turning some of these bolts here and see what we can't pull off. So the socket that I found that is really snug on these axle bolts right here is gonna be a 13/16. I'm pretty sure the metric size, I'm pretty sure it's a 21 millimeter, but a 13/16 is just super snug on those. And then on your lower shock, I believe it's an 18 and a 15, and then same on your sway bar link, an 18 and a 15. So we're gonna pop all these off here. We're gonna chalk our front tires so the truck can't roll forward or backwards on us before we do that, and then we'll get our axle U-bolts all taken off and we'll go from there. Okay guys, so here's the deal. We took off the U-bolts and brackets that are around the axle, and it was a fight to say the least. We ran into a lot of rust. Well, I'll just show you guys exactly what I experienced here. So as we come under the truck, here is the amount of rust that fell off from taking those U-bolts and brackets off. And the other side, same thing. Piles, pieces of rust. Now the U-bolts are off. One of them did indeed break, but luckily it had pulled right out. We didn't have a ton of luck with the electric impact. It was able to take a couple of those nuts off. Not all of them by any means. And then some of these other U-bolts, I mean, these are so thin in some places. You can see where they've just worn. That one is literally bent. Just bent. So, I think it's very good that we are doing this lift, because I think those U-bolts would have snapped at some point, and then our axle would have just been loose and maybe detached from our truck. Now, what I have learned in the first 30 minutes of our build on this Dakota is that it's not going to be easy. Bolts are going to be broken, tears might be shed, and this is going to be a lot harder than I initially thought. But will we let this Dakota, this 2001 Dodge, beat us? No, we won't. We will conquer this old truck, and we will make it badass. So now that the hard part of that is done, we will take our shocks off. We'll kind of loosen the lower bolts from them so they're detached. And then we can jack up the rear of the truck and separate it from the axle. All right, so now we're clipping right along. So we got the shocks taken off, the lower bolts there, so you can see that those have just extended down past their mounting brackets there. So I actually, for just a 2-inch lift, suspension lift, you can use the factory shocks on these Dakotas. So you can see that that shock extends down probably 5 inches or so below the mounting point. So you do have plenty of travel if you just do a 2-inch suspension lift on these Dakotas to use the factory shocks. When you go beyond a 2-inch suspension lift, that is when you need to get longer shocks. But for 2 inches, we'll use the factories. So now we're gonna jack up the rear end. So I've done this a few different ways in the past. So I've done it before where I just did one side at a time. So kind of loosen those U-bolts, took them completely off on one side, jack the truck up on the left side, put in the block, lower it down. When you do one side at a time, those leaf springs don't perfectly line up with your block, your lift block that you're putting in. So sometimes you have to take a bar and kind of nudge that leaf spring a little bit to get it into place. But we're just gonna lift the whole back end of the truck up all at once. So I've just got a couple blocks here. You know, I've just got the factory scissor jack. I put it under the rear receiver. So we're just gonna jack up from there. We'll see if this lifts this the rear end of this truck up evenly on both sides, that we can just slip in our blocks on each side and then lower it down. We'll see how that goes. All right, so as we were jacking up the rear, those leaf springs are just kind of still attached. They're kind of rusted to that rear axle there. And so it kind of wants to pull the tire off the ground just a little bit. So now that I've got kind of all the weight off the tires, I'm just gonna put a little pry bar. Oh, this baby will pry work. So I'm just gonna kind of slip that in between the leaf spring and the axle. I'm gonna tap it with a hammer so it kind of just wedges that leaf spring and axle apart. Okay, so it took a couple taps, but you can see that now that separated our leaf spring from the axle there. So we're just gonna do the same on our passenger side and see what happens here. Yep, just a couple whacks and then we're separated there now. So now I'll just keep jacking up the rear end until we have 2 inches of space on either side, and then we'll just slip our blocks in right there, and then we'll just lower the truck down. Easy as that. All right, so that worked like a charm. So we've just raised our jack up here until we had about 2 inches worth of space under each rear axle there. So now we opened up our new lift kit here. So we have 2 of our lifting blocks here. So those we will install right now. We'll just kind of fit in between there. And then we have our new U-bolts that are extended, obviously to compensate for the extra height we get from our lifting blocks. And then we have 8 little washers and then 8 new nuts. And so we will just put those U-bolts on over the leaf spring. We'll throw a washer on, throw a nut on. It's pretty straightforward from here on out. All right, so I had the girlfriend come out and kind of help me line things up there. So she just lowered the jack as I kind of held that axle, you know, right where it needed to be so that those little nubs, those little posts could line up, kind of fall into the axle. So they're kind of going into the axle, but we've still got a little bit of a gap there. Everything's in the right place. So that's perfect. But what I'm gonna do is just put those U-bolts on. And I think there's just a little rust or corrosion that's kind of holding those new posts up. Because I think the old ones, you know, they kind of rusted a little bit. And so I think just putting these new U-bolts on, you know, I'll put our brackets on, we'll clean those up a little bit. and then we'll put our new washers and nuts on. We'll cinch those down, and I think that's just gonna pull our leaf springs right to our blocks and our axles here. All right, so just like I thought, once we put our U-bolts on, kind of around the leaf spring and axle, it snugged that up real flush around there. So there's no gap. So we're just gonna kind of do the same up on our other one, just to close that gap there. We'll put our U-bolts around. And one thing I'll say is that on top of the leaf spring, you're gonna have this little plate up here. And so this little plate, you'll kind of have little recessions here where your old U-bolts were. And so what I do is I just fit the new U-bolts right around there. They kind of find their spot. So you'll want to make sure that your new U-bolts are around those little recessions in that top plate there. But otherwise, we'll just put our new U-bolts on. We'll cinch those down so it kind of pinches our leaf spring to our axle here, and then we'll move to doing the front. All right, so we've got our blocks installed in the back so you can take a look at those. U-bolts are on, everything is cinched up tight on both sides there. So we're just gonna hook our shocks back up on both sides. But now we'll just move to the front and we'll start doing those front torsion keys and jack up the front side. All right, so we've got the front end of our truck on jack stands here. So as we're looking at it, we will just climb under here. All right, so as we're looking at the front of the pickup, so there is the front of our truck there. So this rod coming back, this is our torsion bar, okay? It is gonna come back to our torsion key. Let me move my light, which is gonna be right here. So this is our torsion key bolt. This being our torsion key, it's like a big hex-shaped key that your torsion rod fits into. So we're just gonna crank this bolt down basically all the way that we can until it is flush with the top of this bracket here. So cranking that key and putting some pressure on that, sorry, it's dark under here. I'm trying to get the right angle. So cranking this bolt down is going to turn this key, which is going to essentially twist our rod and raise our front suspension. So we already took our measurements on either side from the ground to the top of the fender. And so we are just gonna crank both of these here, and then we are going to see if we can't raise the front of our truck 2 inches. So this is gonna be interesting. I always like to jack the front end of the truck up to turn these bolts because it makes it a little bit easier. So I'm just going to put a socket. I believe that's a 13/16 or a 22 millimeter. I'll confirm once I get a socket on it. But I'm just gonna get my 3-foot breaker bar and I am gonna turn that a 1/4 turn at a time. So it's probably gonna take me about 20 minutes to just crank those 2 bolts up all the way until they stop. But we gotta do it. So it's gonna take some muscle, but we'll do that, and then we'll take our measurements once we take the front end off of our jack stands, and we'll see where we're at. All right, so we got the front torsion keys cranked. 0 problems there. They turned out or cranked up really nicely. So that was actually the easiest part of our suspension lift on this. Usually that is the hardest part, but we ran into so many problems with those U-bolts and with the rear end. My goodness. Oh, and check out our rust pile that we have. So like using the impact gun, it was just like shaking things, and this pile of rust that we have that fell off. I mean, here's my hand next to that, and this thing is thick, and it's just like big pieces. Now, you might be scared seeing that, but you shouldn't be scared. It's my pickup truck. I'm the one who should be scared. But at the end of the day, I'm just not at all. You know, if you live in a state like Arizona or some state that doesn't salt the roads, you know, that rusty vehicles aren't as common, Sure, seeing that or seeing all the rust on our rear axles might make you scared, but I've worked with enough older cars here and enough of these old Dakotas, which are seemingly all rusty, that I didn't see anything that really concerned me that much. You know, one thing I'll say is that those plates that kind of go under the axle on the U-bolts that kind of hold your axle to the leaf springs, those plates, those brackets, sometimes I have seen instances where those need to be replaced. And so I will actually put a link to the part number that you can order those off Amazon or eBay. I'll put a link to whatever one is cheaper, but good quality still. But sometimes those plates will be so rusty or could be cracked, you might look at them and just not really trust them or not want to put them back on your truck. And you are putting on new U-bolts with that lift kit as well, so I'll put a link to those. That's something you just have to evaluate for yourself if you think they're too rusty, too old to put back on. But even though ours were dirty and rusty, they seemed super solid still, so I threw them back on. I'm not too concerned about those as of now. But as far as the truck, you know, I mean, the 2-inch lift that we've done so far looks really good. So kind of looking at the wheel wells, man, those factory wheels look tiny in there. So that 2 inches worked super well. And then in the front always sits a little bit lower in these Dakotas. You know, you kind of have a factory, well, if I can show them both, kind of a factory raked look. But all together, man, it looks great so far. So 2 inches achieved. So now, tomorrow we'll rip into the body lift. So that'll give us another 3 inches. So, and that is gonna be interesting. We're gonna see if we run into any other rusty bolts on it. See if anything breaks, you know, and if it does, you can't let that ruin your day. I've had it happen before on these, and you work around it and work through it. Yeah, suspension lift is done. Stay tuned to see the rest. Like I said, we're doing the body lift tomorrow, and then I'm probably gonna do all the electrical stuff the day after that. So our headlights, taillights, third brake light, our new speakers, our 4 speakers that we're putting on the interior to replace, I don't know if it has factory speakers or aftermarket ones, but they're terrible, they're blown out, they sound awful. But yeah, she's coming together, first step complete. So like the video if this helped you out, subscribe if you want to see more, and until next time guys, have a wonderful night.
Wanna waste our time in the moonlight, run me up all night.